Our next speaker is from Laing O'Rourke. Richard Coleman will be canvassing their traffic management fatality elimination controls. Richard's the head of health, safety and environment at Laing O'Rourke, and he's over 30 years of experience in safety, human resource and operational roles. We will have the opportunity to ask Richard some questions after the presentation, so please send them through, and we say a big welcome to Richard Coleman.
Thanks very much. Let me start by saying I'm probably not going to make the brief. I started out thinking that I would talk to you in great detail about the way that we control our risks. And then I thought, you know what, this audience probably knows much of that stuff. So what I'm actually going to do is tell you a story. And it's a story from the Second World War. And the reason that I'm going to tell you that story is that I think there are some key learnings in this story for all of us who are concerned with occupational or public safety matters, and it's a story that points to a way of thinking about those issues that I found personally quite impactful. So the story I'm going to tell you is about a gentleman called Abraham Wald. Now, what I love about this story is that Abraham was a Jewish guy who was essentially chased out of Europe by the Nazis. And in a very major way, they would live to regret that decision. It's a classic case of not all heroes wear capes, right? So Abraham was possibly the coolest nerd in the world, often described as the smartest man in any room where there were smart people. And his work at Columbia University was around statistics. And he led this group called the Statistical Research Group. And they did interesting engineering around issues to do with fighting the war. As listed here, curves that fighter planes should take to keep other planes in their targets, quality sampling regimes, how you load machine guns so they fire more effectively. As an aside, one of the interesting parts about Jacob's story was he would do all this research and would write it up, and he would then hand it to people who would then bind it in a report. Once it was bound in a report, because he was deemed an enemy alien because he'd come over from Austria, he was no longer allowed to read the stuff that he'd written, which is kind of a fascinating way to manage your smartest talent. Anyway, this is the point of my story. The US Air Force came to Jacob and they said, we have a problem. Aeroplanes keep getting shot down. We're having unacceptable losses. So we want to do some work to understand where we need to put the armour on aeroplanes. Now, armour is important for aeroplanes, but it makes them heavier. They're less manoeuvrable. They take more fuel, and more armour means that more planes they make them less manoeuvrable, which means they potentially get shot down. Air Force gave Jacob Wald a table of data that I'm sharing with you today, and down the left-hand side of that table are parts of an airplane, and on the right-hand side there are the bullet holes per square foot of that airplane. And they said, look, with this data, where do you think we should put the armour? You know, what should we be putting this armour on the parts of the airplane that keep getting hit? And he approached the problem quite differently. But I will take you to how to answer that question in a slightly different way. Think about if you go to a war zone, right, and you go into a hospital in a war zone. You likely see people with bullet holes in arms, legs, but less with wounds to the head or the chest. You kind of ask, you know, why is that? Well, I'll leave you to sort of ponder that, because the answer clearly is that the people who get shot in the head or in the chest don't end up in hospital. Unfortunately, they end up dying. Jacob Wald made the same connection with aeroplanes. Right? He basically said, the data that you're bringing me shows that we're having all these events. You're bringing a set of data that shows me that the planes that come back are the ones with bullet holes in these places. Why don't we try and put the armour where the bullet holes aren't. So rather than looking at the data in front of me and using the bullet hole data to decide where to put the armour, let's put it where we have no information. Those airplanes that haven't come back, how do we compare those to the ones that do come back? Let's put the armour on the engines. Jacob Ward's research saved thousands of lives and essentially continue to be used to this day. The reason I'm sharing this story is that I think that in health and safety in particular, we tend to review the kind of the negative, not the positive. We look at things like injury rates, the vast numbers of injury rates that we have across whatever industry that we work in, and we go, actually, that's where we should put our attention, right? Where that drives you to, unfortunately, particularly if you take a view that you should go where the most things happen, in our industry, in construction, it becomes manual handling and slip, trips and falls, right? There's 70% of the issues. We rarely test our assumptions about whether or not working in that space, dealing with the data that we've got in front of us, is whether or not that's a relevant, smart, intelligent thing to be doing in the moment. So my hypothesis or my thesis that I want to share with you is that potentially there are places for us to put controls where the bullets aren't, right? It's not those places where the most injuries are coming from. We need to put controls in place that are protecting from those very high consequence, low probability type events. So for Laing O'Rourke, and actually thank you to the previous speaker who gave us a shout out, that was wonderful. For Laing O'Rourke, our approach is very much not to discount minor injury. We certainly take that seriously, and we don't want people to be hurt on our projects. But we're never going to shift our resource from thinking about the high severity, low probability risks in our business to those higher frequency, lower consequence type injuries. Manual handling, slip, trips and falls are the classic examples. So if you go to our material, which I believe has been shared with everybody, it's on the web at nextgearsms.com. All our health and safety management material is freely available to anyone in any industry. There you'll find our fatal and severe risk standards, which lay out the controls that we put in place on our projects. You'll find all our management system documentation, guidance material, some training materials. Got a very strong view that material should be open sourced and shared with industry more broadly. We'd love for you to download that material, use it, and absolutely comment, give us advice if you think that it needs work. I'll just touch on how we use this material. In any construction operation, there is a project plan and there's a critical path, and there are tasks that need to be sequenced in the most efficient order. That planning process gives you a sense of when critical activities are going to happen and what risks need to be controlled at that time. We use our fatal and severe risk planning process to say, okay, if we have I think Central Station was mentioned, if we're in a phase of that project where traffic issues are going to be higher than normal, or there's a particular activity that's going to drive greater volumes, in the time leading up to that activity, we're going to make sure that our fatal and severe risk controls are in place. So we use the schedule of the project and the controls that are listed out in those standards. We marry those together so that those risks are managed at the right time in the project. So we have a whole range of different FSRs covering roughly 16 fatal and severe risks. Traffic management is one of the key ones, and we've shared this material with everyone today. Our intent with this stuff is, as I said before, to really focus in on those high consequence risks. That's the location for this material. As I said, it is publicly available. No IP on this stuff. There's posters, there's assessment tools, and there's standards. And I said there's some examples of those documents that we're happy to share. And I expect I've smashed that in terms of time. No, has anyone got any questions?
No, you've done very well. You came in 20 seconds over. I'll pay that, hats off. Thanks very much for that, Richard. Listen, can I ask you, that's all well and good to say focus on the high consequence risks, and we're not all as smart as Abraham Wald. So how is it that you assess what the high consequence risks are within the phase of the business, right?
So firstly, I came in actually when the gentleman from Downer was speaking, yes, and I caught a little bit of him suggesting that you kind of need to listen to the workforce and come up with deal with the issues that they raised. So our process for identifying those fatal and severe risks has been through using the power of experience of our people. So many of our projects are staffed by people with literally hundreds and hundreds of years of experience in the aggregate in construction. So let's understand the phase of the work and the risks that fall out of that. My point about Jacob Wald is in health and safety, we're often driven by the numbers, the things that sort of hit us in the face all the time. I think they potentially divert us from the real risks in the business.
Okay, and so how does that change your thinking? Take me through an example of if you're looking at a project, how does that understanding that you've got from Wald change your sense of where the risks lie and how you analyse where the risks lie?
Okay, one of the fundamental principles that we were taught as a profession, and many of the people on this call would have heard before, is this sense that there's a thing called the accident triangle. And frankly, it's abhorrent, and it's driven our profession to a really bad place. And it says essentially that if there are a lot of low consequence type things happening, there's a numerical relationship, right? So if we've got 100 back injuries, we'll eventually have one person die from something, right? There's a numerical relationship. Actually, that's not true. The things that kill people and the things that maim people are not the things that show up in our accident numbers. So the change in thinking is to say, actually, what's the work that's being done? What are the risks that are associated with that work that are the unique things that play out very rarely and that result in people dying, as opposed to those things that play out kind of often. So if you're in a rail job, for example, people trip over on rail ballast. Happens a lot, right? They don't die from that. What they do die from in rail jobs are contacts with mobile machinery, high voltage electricity. They may climb into a confined space and we haven't had the controls in place. So we don't go to where all the injuries are happening. We go to where all the risks live.
Okay, so you know how they always say at the end of any financial presentation that the past is never a perfect indication of the future? So you got all these hundreds of years of experience from people. You know where to look, and you know when you want to look at particular phases within a project. But how do you ensure that your critical controls are still valid and that people are assessing what's in front of them rather than relying on past experience, right?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. There are multiple ways that we do that. And I don't think, and when I say we, I don't think we're unique in doing that. There are a range of governance practices around checking that those controls are in place. But there's also processes for making sure that we update those. And those processes include not only those with the sort of backwards looking experience, but a range of technical experts on work process and around new technology and the way the industry is changing and activities are changing, so that their input is married with the input of the workforce and our operational people.
Okay, so you're stress testing it. I'm going to ask you one of those questions that you might choose to avoid. It's one of those things that people do. Journalists ask a question, they try and avoid the answer. There's nothing I can do to compel you to answer the question. How useful is what regulators are asking you to manage in terms of risk relative to what you think you ought to be managing in terms of risk?
What is the standard politician question? I reject the premise of the question.
That's usually what people say, yes.
Look, frankly, I think regulators more and more are doing a good job. Right? I think that regulators have moved away. If you asked me that 15 years ago, I'd had a very different sense. I think regulators have got the message that where they need to play is in the space of the critical risks in most of the industries in which they operate. They could get better at moving away from caring just about paperwork and actually connecting with people to understand where the risks are actively being managed and people are engaged with that process. But if you were to ask me to mark them out of 10, I'd probably give most of them a 7.5.
Okay. And last question, have you been able to measure what this different mindset means in terms of those really bad accidents and fatalities? Can you show it works?
So one of the things that I can't do is show you a downward trending graph of fatalities and serious injuries. Because frankly they're so rare that anything would be statistically invalid if I showed it to you anyway. What I can show you is I think the best measure in our business, when we annually ask our staff and our subcontractors, does Laing O'Rourke put safety before budget and program? We asked that very pointed question. We asked it 4 years ago. 55% of people said yes. We asked it last year, and 85% said yes. So the sense of connection to the issues and the willingness to engage in these processes and the recognition that as an organisation we drive that forward is really real. And
in this case, in this area, perception is to some extent reality, right? If that's what people are perceiving the focus is, then they'll make that the focus.
I'd go further than that, say it's not to some extent, it is reality.
Richard, it's been great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
That was Richard Coleman.